Welcome to 60 Skills. Today we are going to learn how to construct or make your own rituals. In this lesson you will learn everything you need to know about how to put one of these together, why you would want to do this, and how to make rituals a practical reality for utilizing the various skills you have learned magically or meditatively at a moment's notice without all of the normal layup required by most practitioners. This process will discuss the role of Akasha, your own astral temple, and most importantly, how to do this in a way that is most useful to you in your day-to-day life. So, join 60 Skills today as we learn everything there is to learn about constructing your own rituals. Welcome to 60 Skills. We will now discuss the requirements for the course known as How to Construct Your Own Rituals. To construct your own rituals, ideally you will have reached the point at which you can generate your own Akasha. If you can't do this, it's okay. As long as you can astral breathe and engage in mental wandering, you can also utilize this technique. That said, it will come with the caveat that you will need to recharge your ritual much more often. As when working with a ritual at the level of Akasha, these things largely become self-empowering, whereas at the astral level, it will work more along the lines of a battery-based system. That said, you will also need a quiet place in which to practice this technique, and it is very important that you will not be disturbed while doing this. So if you have your own sacred space, or your own sacred space in a time and place, this works best. Additionally, when building rituals, building them in the same place is also helpful. So keep in mind, while none of these things are absolute requirements, they will all make performance of this technique much easier. Let us begin. Welcome to 60 Skills. What is a ritual? A ritual is a series of meditative steps linked in succession that are designed to generate a specific effect. Specifically, this specific effect will also have a kind of battery or stored energy worked up around it. So basically, you become better at rituals by practicing them over time and applying more and more energy to that ritual. Now, the thing with rituals is they tend to take a lot of time. These can be very complex, such as many of the systems included in the Golden Dawn, or they can be very simple, such as establishing equilibrium. It's important to keep in mind that ritual magicians work off this system entirely. And in their case, they don't even need to have much internal energy development conducted, simply because they've applied a little bit of energy at a time to a ritual over a very long period of time. The Egregores in particular utilize the ritual principle quite a great deal. For our purposes, what we will be doing here is creating rituals of our own. The reason for doing this is quite simple. Rituals that have been designed or utilized by other people also have large egregores built up around them. This can be beneficial on the one hand, or it can cause practitioners problems on the other. By generating your own rituals, they will lack a certain power associated with many older rituals, such as the Latin Mass from Western Christianity, but they will be entirely yours and quite clean and devoid of any meaning that you personally have not applied to them. And this, in truth, is the one main advantage of creating your own rituals. By doing this, you are creating a clean slate off of which to work that no one else has access to. Depending upon how you structure these, many people will have no idea that you've triggered one at all. So keep in mind, rituals that are created by you are also powered by you, but are bereft of influence from outside forces and allow you to conduct things rather quickly and on the fly, which makes many of our meditative techniques practical in the real world. Let us begin. Welcome to 60 Skills. We will now discuss the differences between an egregore-powered ritual and a private ritual or internal power ritual. All right, first of all, there's the obvious difference. As discussed previously, rituals build power through repeat practice of that ritual. It's a lot like charging a battery or putting a little bit of money each month into a bank account. Over a long period of time, you end up with something that's far stronger than it was in the beginning. Fair enough. That said, when you were dealing with an egregore-powered ritual, you were dealing with some very, very old technology. Things such as the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, the Latin Mass. These are all examples of very old, very powerful rituals. The advantage to this is when you know how to access these things, it allows a practitioner who has not done much internal power development to act at a higher frequency than they would be able to do on their own. The disadvantage is obvious, as is true with anything that involves an egregore. The egregore also influences and slightly feeds off the practitioner. This is how these things stay empowered, and it is a necessary part of their development. And let me be clear, if you are utilizing an older ritual designed by somebody else that has been used over a very long period of time, you will be paying energy forward on the net end in order to make it work. It's just how these things function. That is not necessarily bad, however, depending upon what your personal goals are. Now we will get into the issue of private or personal rituals. These rituals are designed by individual practitioners. Because they are designed by individual practitioners, they do not have the added bonus of having lots of people all over the world over a long period of time feed energy into them. However, they come with the advantage in that they are bereft of any baggage provided by someone else. Because of this, these rituals tend to be very clean. In a practical matter, these things are usually triggered by a combination of gesture and sound, and this is intentionally done in order to allow a practitioner to skip steps. So, a good example of this. If you create a ritual around, say, Fa Jin, or the explosive discharge of power, now, instead of having to go through the whole process of touching your partner's base, setting up a line of force, getting braced, having the body in the right position, a practitioner can simply trigger that ritual and throw their training partner. This makes this kind of thing useful in the real world where you don't have a lot of time to set up various steps. Someone who's intelligent can also look at many advantages of this that can be used for healing people or engaged in any of the esoteric arts. However, anything that is used to power that private ritual has to be done by the practitioner themselves. They can't lean upon anyone else in order to power this up. But because the gesture they're using and the sounds they're engaging to trigger these things are not known by other people, they're free to do it whenever they want, and the simple fact of the matter is, if conducted intelligently, most other people will not know that you're doing this. So this is the difference between an egregore-powered ritual on the one hand and a private or internal power ritual on the other. The first can be systems of development under their own because they're so powerful. The other makes things useful on a day-to-day basis. So again, this isn't an either-or kind of proposition, but I'm just laying out some of the differences between the two so you can begin to think about how you might want to employ this technology. Let us begin. Welcome to 60 Skills. We will now discuss how to structure your rituals. First, you have to decide what it is you're going to use the ritual for. Take some time, because the simple fact of the matter is you have to power these things up at a certain level, and you have to remember how to use them. Additionally, you have to remember how to trigger them to the point where it's kind of what you would call a matter of habit. And the reason for this is very simple. If you have to think about the gesture and sound combination you're going to use to trigger your ritual, it makes it a little clunky. And you're probably not going to be able to do this on the fly or in response to a stimulus in your environment as you need. So this needs to be something that you do frequently enough or is important enough that you'll always remember how to trigger it. Okay, so you've decided what you want to use this for, and you've structured how to go about performing all the different steps of the ritual. From the very beginning with something like pour breathing, all the way to equilibrium, all the way to the effect you want to generate, so on and so on and so on. Next, you're going to need to come up with a gesture that you want to use in order to trigger the ritual. I personally advise you to make gestures two parts. One, there's going to be a motion that you're going to conduct, and two, there is going to be a sound you are going to make. Now, what's important about this is the sound that you utilize can be an internally generated sound. The advantage to this system is people can see the gesture and potentially copy that if they know what they're doing. But it takes someone with a very high level of clairaudience to hear the internal sound you're making to accompany that gesture. So in this regard, having a twofold system for doing something makes it very useful and very safe for you. Also keep in mind, the gesture utilized can be something complicated like various mudra, or it can be something very subtle. I in fact know people that use their toes to trigger certain gestures. Good luck figuring out that they're doing that in public. So again, the nature of the gesture can be very gross, it can be complicated, it can involve a two-part movement, or it can be something very simple, or something that you can't even see with the eye, because it involves, your foot, or pulling up on your perineum, or placing your tongue in a very specific part of your mouth. Literally, the different ways to do this are endless. It's really up to you. The internal sounds as well help, and you can even include an external vocalization if you wish. It's really up to you. But now that you understand this, you can look at different mudras that are used in common systems and begin to understand how these things were put together. So, all right, you've determined what you want to work on. You've determined all the different steps that have to take place in order to make that thing happen. And you've determined both the gesture and the sound that you want to use. Keep in mind, most people will want to use the same gesture and sound to turn something on and to turn something off. You can come up with a different gesture and sound to turn something on, and then another one to turn something off. But this tends to complicate issues and result in your having to remember how to do two things. And keep in mind, remembering how to do two things under duress or when you're in a hurry is incredibly difficult. So you're going to want to make these things fairly simple, and I strongly advise keeping with simply one. So these are some basics of some things you need to think about when you are engaging in ritual design. Let us begin. Welcome to 60 Skills. We will now discuss different gestures and sounds that may be employed when triggering a ritual. All right, we talked a little earlier about how gestures can be complicated or simple, and sounds can be either internal or vocalized. And how when you look at classical mudras and their accompanying mantras, it's easy to see how this technology is widely used and overlays a lot of ground. As a practical matter, I've found I really can't keep track of more than maybe half a dozen gestures at any one time. So keep in mind that you really only want a limited repertoire of these things. Otherwise, if you have too many of them, it's going to be hard to be able to remember how to use them when you need to use them. All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the gestures that can be used. It can be something as simple as touching two specific fingers together. It can be something as simple as touching a specific joint or digit on your hand. It can be very complicated things like this, or like this, or it can also incorporate movement, such as, or. So again, it can be simple or it can be complicated. You can also utilize whole body postures for things like this. So from the Golden Dawn system, you have the gesture of the enterer. Or you have the various Hatha Yoga postures that can be employed as well. The simple fact of the matter is there are a million different ways to do this. Some involve using a digit on the hand, some involve the use of the whole body. You can also do more subtle things, like placing the tongue on a specific part of the mouth or a specific tooth. This, in turn, is something that most people are not going to be able to see. As I mentioned earlier, some people choose to use gestures involving their toes. Again, the way you can do this is literally quite endless. Now we get into the issue of the sound that you want to accompany this. Now, this can be done silently by making a sound internally, like a ticking noise, or maybe the sound of an eagle crying that accompanies your gesture. Or you can utilize a vocalization. The advantage of a vocalization, even though it's quite a bit flashier than using a silent sound, is it also liberates a lot of energy at both the astral and vital level. Depending upon what you're trying to do, this can be very useful. Things like the kiai from certain Japanese martial arts are an example of this when used ritually. So again, you're going to need to put some real thought into what gestures and what sounds you wish to employ, whether they be subtle or more gross. It's really up to you. But again, as usual, I recommend using both a gesture and a sound, as this tends to make it much more difficult for someone observing you to be able to use your ritual. And finally, this is something to keep in mind, is that once you've built up this power source around a ritual, if people have the right keys to access them, they can. So a lot of these things you're simply going to want to keep to yourself. And as I mentioned earlier, if you intend to use these on the fly or practically in the environment around you, you really can't have too many of them. Let us begin. Welcome to 60 Skills. We will now discuss things to use a ritual for. All right. Many different ways of applying this technology exist. Literally anything you can do in esoterica, you can build a ritual for. I personally have a couple of these, one of which is for the Fajin or throwing exercises. This way, if I need to use something spontaneously for whatever reason, I don't have to go through the full setup of getting my body into position, making contact with my partner's base, bracing, getting ready to receive, and all of the other steps required in order to conduct that. I can just trigger my ritual and internal sound, and off they go. Other people might want to use this for things like healing. If you run, say, an acupuncture or energy medicine clinic, being able to trigger that ritual and go in and place healing energy into multiple patients quickly is very useful. Other people may want to use this for things like triggering their clairvoyance. Literally, the list is endless. And in this context, the main advantage to doing this is it allows you to do things very quickly that normally take a lot of time to set up. Another example of this is I have a ritual designed for establishing equilibrium. So instead of having to go through all the different stages of putting energy into my head, into my chest, into my abdomen, into my legs, and calling out all the sounds, I can just turn it on like that. It is also important to remember that when you're doing this, you need to have the off switch fairly well established as well. Because once you turn these things on, they tend to stay on. Additionally, you need to keep your intention with this very pure. The intention that you put into building the ritual is every bit as important as the intention that you carry around with yourself. This is just a simple reality or matter of fact. So you need to have the intention you want to engage placed into the ritual as you build it, and the ritual will work best if you trigger it when you're in a neutral state. So these are some things to think about in terms of the how and why of using rituals. Now, you can have much more complicated rituals, such as you see in the Golden Dawn, that have many, many, many different steps, and you can build this up on your own as well. That said, most of what this course is used for is triggering a ritual on short notice in the real world. This, in turn, makes many of these esoteric skills we spend all this time developing practical. It also removes the need for you to look like a loon or lunatic in public. So you're not going through all these crazy pantomime steps. You're just triggering it automatically on your own. So again, these are all things to think about, and there's no right way or wrong way to do this. Do keep in mind that as a practical matter, most people can only hold the details of maybe 2 or 3 or 6 or a dozen rituals in their mind with enough clarity to be able to use them under duress. So in general, you're only going to want to apply this to something that's very important to you, or that you need to do on a moment's notice with great regularity. Let us begin. Welcome to 60 Skills. We will now discuss the need to revisit or limitations associated with building your own ritual. All right, on the meta level, as we've already discussed, a personal ritual will generally lack the power of an older, more established ritual. This is simply a functional matter based off the fact that if something's been around a long time, there have been an awful lot of people continually putting a little more and a little more energy into it. The Latin Mass is a supreme example of this, as are many of the older Buddhist tantric rituals. A lot of the rituals from Shingon Buddhism, or from fire or puja ceremony or Goma rituals, are incredibly powerful. And they're incredibly powerful because people have been doing these things for many thousands of years. All right, so that's the one hand, a limitation that you have between a more established or egregore-powered ritual and a personal ritual. Let's talk about some others. First, whatever level of ability you had when you establish your ritual is the level of ability you will exhibit that ritual at. This can be both an advantage or a disadvantage. For example, I personally have a ritual that I use to engage in Fa-Jin, or the explosive discharge of force. I built this ritual after practicing these techniques extensively for extended periods of time over many months. As a result, when I do this, I can generate quite a bit of force. However, it comes with a disadvantage in that as long as I use the ritual to do this, and I don't bother to build my strength back up at that thing, I will forever be limited by whatever level of ability I had when I originally generated the ritual. 2, my body is quite a bit older now. I'm not in very good condition anymore, particularly relative to the condition I was in when I established the ritual in the first place. So it takes a lot out of me to use this. Again, there's no free lunch when it comes to these kinds of practices. Whatever amount of energy it takes to trigger a ritual and make it work still has to come out of the piggy bank. And this is where a lot of older practitioners get into a lot of trouble. They establish these rituals when they're much younger, and then they use them in order to do different things, particularly at seminars or in order to demonstrate different techniques. But now their body doesn't have the energy they had 40 years ago. This becomes quite expensive. Also, by eliminating all of those setup steps and just jumping directly into something, Rituals allow a practitioner to do something that their body might not necessarily be prepared for in the moment they choose to use it. Because of this, whenever I use this technique to demonstrate Fa-Zhen at a higher level than I'm capable of normally, there is a tendency or a much greater likelihood of my becoming injured. This is a huge problem, and it's not a problem that gets better with time. So, we've discussed the issue of your level of ability is capped at whatever level of ability you had when you established the ritual. We've discussed the fact that the energy required to generate the ritual at the level you established doesn't change. We've also established how rituals can be used to override the necessity to assume a certain body position or to brace yourself before you perform them, which increases the likelihood of injury depending upon what kind of ritual you choose to engage in. Okay, now we need to discuss the need to revisit rituals. Because rituals largely work off the storehouse principle, if you don't revisit the techniques that built that ritual and repeat the ritual and recharge it periodically, it tends to get stale. This will be further amplified in our next discussion involving the difference between an Akashic and an astral level ritual. But the simple fact of the matter is, you need to revisit these rituals periodically. If for no other reason than simply remembering how to do them can become a bit of a problem over time if it's not something you do very often. In any event, a ritual that isn't performed with a fair amount of frequency usually won't have much ability or power behind it and quickly becomes stale. At this point you can still do it, but even the level of ability you had developed when you put the ritual together frequently softens and kind of mushes out over time. So it's important to remember that another disadvantage with rituals is you have to revisit them. In some cases, you'll need to revisit them with quite a bit. Other cases, not so much. But revisit them you will if you choose to keep them functional. So these are a few things you need to think about when you develop your own rituals and how to employ them. Let us begin.